So I already mentioned arteries, capillaries and veins when I talked about our circulatory system, but we have to go in a little more detail on how they work and what they do. The artery is usually the blood vessels that take oxygenated blood from the heart and into the working tissue. There is of course a single exception to this rule, but in general, since they come right from the heart, they have a high blood pressure. So the walls and the muscle around the arteries are strong and elastic to be able to handle this high blood pressure. As the blood then comes into the tissue, it goes into the capillaries. The capillaries, they are very thin and they need to have a thin wall because as I talked about in the beginning, this is where diffusion needs to happen. Now, for oxygen to diffuse out into the tissue and for CO2 to diffuse in, we need a thin wall and a short distance. So the capillaries are many, they're very small, and it's like you can have a single red blood cell going through at a time. So you have a very, very short distance that the oxygen and CO2 need to diffuse. As we then have the deoxygenated blood going back from the body to the heart, it goes through the veins. The veins will have a much lower pressure than the arteries, so they don't need the wall to be as thick. On the other hand, because they have a low pressure, we have these valves, the same as we have in the heart, as in type, which means that the blood can only run one way. Since there's not that much pressure coming from the heart, they use the pressure of the muscles to push on the blood, and then the valves make sure that the blood will keep running in the right direction. So now we talk a lot about the transport system, but this transport system would not matter unless it had something to transport. And what is transporting inside you is your blood. You have approximately about 5 liters of blood running around in your body now. And if we take a blood sample and we spin it in a high velocity centrifuge, we'll see we have 3 different layers. We'll have the red blood cells, we have the white blood cells. I marked them with green here because it is a little hard to mark white on a whiteboard. And then we have the plasma. So these are the 3 main compartments of the blood. And now I'm going to go into detail about what they do. You will have around somewhere between 40 to 45% red blood cells. That's called a hematocrit. It might be lower, it might be higher. If it's higher than 50 and you're in the Tour de France, that's when you get kicked out for doping. So usually it is something around the 40 area. You need the plasma as well, because if you only had the red blood cells, the blood will be too thick to flow through the capillaries in the proper way. On the other hand, if you have too few red blood cells, the blood will run really easily, but it'll carry very little oxygen. So, in our blood we have our red blood cells. The red blood cells are a unique cell because they don't have a cell core. We make them in the bone marrow and they're not supposed to last very long. They have this donut shape which makes them go easily through our capillaries, and they are filled with hemoglobin, which is the protein that carries our O2 and our CO2. Then we have our white blood cells, which is a very important part of the immune system, and you can separate them from the red blood cells not only by the iron content but also by the fact that they have a cell core. And then we have the platelets, which are small cell fragments. They have no core and their role is to help heal wounds. We all tried, if we cut ourselves, then the body will start reforming a barrier, and that is what the platelets do. Then we have the plasma. The plasma is not just liquid, it is also an important part of our entire system. So it is water, it's also glucose, how we transport carbohydrates around the body. It carries hormones from the glands to the active tissue. It carries lipids, fats. It also helps carry dissolved CO2 and O2. So it's not only the respiratory pigments in here that carries the gases. Some of it is carried in the plasma as well. It carries waste products such as urea. It can carry proteins and it carries minerals. So this is kind of a transport system for everything else in the body. So not only does it help transport our red and white blood cells around, it in itself carries food and waste products around in the body to make sure it gets the right organs. So those 5 liters of blood we have are pretty amazing, and that's why if we lose them, we die. So if we zoom in on a red blood cell, it contains a protein called hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is a protein that has 4 active sites. It's folded in a tetrahedral structure. There are 4 active sites, each of them containing a molecule of iron. That molecule of iron binds very efficient to O2. So when our blood is fully oxygenated, there are 4 O2 molecules bind to the hemoglobin. That makes it very efficient for carrying O2, but it does something else as well. When this gets to the active tissue and releases the O2, that also, the same active site can also bind CO2. And as it starts to bind those CO2 molecules, its structure changes and it gets even more likely to release the rest of the O2. So it releases maybe, and now we have blood that is deoxygenated. It mainly carries O2. It's not always that it loses all the oxygen. Now when this red blood cell then comes back to the lungs, there is more CO2 in here than out in the lung tissue, so it will release the CO2, and by doing so the affinity changes, so it again becomes more likely to take up O2. So the amazing thing about hemoglobin is it's able both to carry the CO2 and the O2, and when it releases CO2, its affinity for O2 goes up, and when it releases O2, its affinity for CO2 goes up. So it is the ideal molecule to move both CO2 and O2 around the body. Now this is a bit outside the syllabus, but just so you know, it can also bind the molecule called CO, carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide is poisonous because it binds very, very strongly to the sites here. And when it binds here, our hemoglobin can neither carry O2 or CO2. That closes down part of our transport system. When we smoke, we get carbon monoxide, and that makes our hemoglobin worse at carrying oxygen. And if we, for example, work in a closed environment where there is incomplete combustion, we can get carbon monoxide poisoning. That happens when carbon monoxide blocks too many of the hemoglobin, and then we pretty much get choked because we don't get any O2 to the living tissue. So carbon monoxide is a silent killer, and it's another reason not to smoke. The last part of our transport system here is the lymphatic system. And it's one that doesn't have as much attention in the syllabus as our blood system, but it's still important to know about. When we have blood going through the capillaries, because of the very thin vessels, they are leaky. So they will leak tissue into the fluids. That fluid eventually needs to get back into our system. So we have these small lymphatic capillaries that drains it, and then the liquid there, it goes into lymphatic vessels, which are kind of like drain canals leading the liquid back into the body. This liquid is then carried on into the veins. There is no pump like the heart to pump the lymphatic fluids back towards the veins, but they use muscle movement and the same type of valves that we see in our veins. This is why, for example, if you sit on a plane for a long time, you might see your legs starting to swell up. That is because liquid leaks out there, but there's no muscle movement, so there's no pump to push the liquid back. That is why if you take a long flight, it might be a good idea to go for a walk every now and then, or in other ways make sure that your lymphatic system keeps working. So lymph nodes are part of the lymphatic system, and they help to produce white blood cells, and that is why sometimes if you're sick you might feel some of these lymph nodes, they are swelling. That's a part of your immune system response to diseases. So I know this has been a very long talk. It's quite a complex chapter. Again, if you have the book, I really it's one of those chapters. It's a good way to read it. There's a lot of vocabulary here. There's a lot of things to learn. It's a quite complex system, and it's a very important part of biology to understand how the blood and the heart functions. So take the time to read it, and if you have any questions, please post them here. Any mistakes made in this video are mine alone and not part of the syllabus. Thank you.